Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really pleased to have with me as my guest Jason Rabbitt-Tomita, who's a partner at Baker Botts. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. Really excited to be here with you, Richard.
So, Jason, you have one of the more unusual backgrounds I have come across, and that is that you actually spent a few years working as a lawyer in Japan, a country that I love, and everyone who doesn't love Japan. Tell me a little bit about what made you decide to want to even do that in the first place.
Sure. I think the first inkling I had of wanting to do it was, well, I'm half Japanese, fourth generation. So my great grandparents on my mom's side were from the old country.
Hmm.
So when I went into college, I kind of wanted to do the whole explore my roots thing.
Hmm.
So I started learning Japanese in college. Hadn't really taken any Japanese before then.
I see.
And then my junior year in college, I spent abroad. I moved to Kyoto for my junior year,
Oh,
studied at what was then a Stanford-run consortium center. Now it's run by Columbia, um, where I lived, immersed myself in Japanese society. Had homestay parents who taught me a lot of Japanese. And once I went through that experience, I knew I wanted to live abroad, but it really firmed up my desire to move to Japan
hmm.
after college. So my senior year in college, I went to a job fair for folks interested in living and working in Japan. And I had an interview with Panasonic.
Hmm.
And I actually got a job with Panasonic. At that time, I had applied to law school and I was deferring law school because I wanted to go abroad and work in Japan for a little bit.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
while I was deferring law school, I went and I worked at Panasonic in their overseas division, working on cellular phone base stations in Yokohama, Japan.
Hmm.
And then after a year there, I came back and I went to law school.
I see. And then you went back to Japan again, though. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. So my first 2 years of law school, I was at Harvard. My 2L summer, I spent at Morrison and Foerster in their Tokyo office. I split with their Tokyo office and their San Francisco office.
Hmm.
And I was an exchange student my 3L year in law school at Berkeley, but I actually graduated from Harvard. But yeah, so I decided I really wanted to live and work in Japan as an attorney. And I ended up summering out there and then got an offer to start out there as a first year associate.
Interesting. So let me ask you, between the three different times, sounds like you were there as an attorney, then you were you spent the year there in between college and law school, and then obviously you were there also in Kyoto, you said, as when you were in college. The three different times you were in Japan, it was one, did you enjoy one of those times better than the others, and why, and how was it different maybe?
That's a great question. So when you go out as in your junior year of college, it's obviously a very different experience, as kind of you're alluding to, than when you're working out there as a college graduate, and then when you're working out there as an attorney.
Yeah.
So, my first experience in Japan was really as a college student, just soaking in the sights, trying to really soak in the culture, really try to learn the language as good as I could. Uh, you know, Turned 20 out there, which is legal drinking age. So that was very exciting. Um, just a wonderful time, and then you become more focused professionally as you get older and older. So working at Panasonic was a very unique experience. I'd say a lot of Americans who live and work in Japan don't end up working at Japanese companies. That's a very different experience. A Japanese company like Panasonic really takes the long view towards the development of professionals,
Hmm.
of their workers.
Hmm.
So it's not like a consulting job that a lot of people have after college where you hop in, you're getting right into it, you're doing, a lot of grunt work, but, talking with high level folks at the clients pretty quickly. No, I sort of started as a real base level first year grunt, with the plan being for me to cycle through various departments and tasks at several months at a time. So I would start learning the business as a whole. Um, really, really something that is not the kind of pace for development that maybe other professionals coming out of college would be used to.
Yeah, right. Well, what about also you presumably lived in three different places though, because you lived in Kyoto the first time, then it sounds like Yokohama, and then I assume you were in Tokyo when you worked in at Mofo. Uh,
That's right.
how were those three different cities like? They're obviously very different places.
Sure, sure. Kyoto is a living museum with hundreds of temples. It's the only city that didn't get like firebombed in World War II, so it has a lot of old stuff. It's kind of a very culturally alive and artistic place. And it has a lot of universities. So in that regard, maybe it's a little bit like Boston in the United States.
Hmm.
Yokohama is kind of like a San Diego or a Seattle. It's a port city. It's not too far down from Tokyo. Tokyo is a neighboring prefecture, but it's kind of a newer and younger feel than a lot of other cities in Japan. And I loved it a lot being from Seattle myself. It really
Hmm.
reminded me of home.
Hmm.
But then you go to Tokyo, and Tokyo is really a combination of like New York, LA, and DC because it's the financial, entertainment, and political capital of the country. And the vast majority of large companies and clients are headquartered out there. And so it's a very urban experience, and really kind of an amazing city
Hmm.
to live in.
Yeah, for sure. Now, were you speaking English most of the time you were there, or Japanese, or a mix, or tell me a little about that?
Sure. So I was very, very proficient in Japanese, but I wouldn't call myself fluent. I got to the point where I would walk clients through things in Japanese clients through things in Japanese, but I didn't feel comfortable sending emails in Japanese.
Hmm.
I'd say there's sort of two sorts of attorneys who have, US qualifications who work out there, and it really is a language divide. There are people who are very natively fluent in Japanese, and they're able to do things that I wasn't able to do.
Hmm.
And then on my side, I was really being hired and engaged to be an English speaker.
I see.
So, in terms of the workflow, I myself would, we would be hired as American attorneys, not to do, a domestic Japanese to Japanese transaction. You'd
Yeah.
really be hired to do something international. And there would be two types of transactions you would do. One would be an inbound transaction for a non-Japanese client where they want to interact with you in English, and you end up working closely with your Japanese colleagues or a local Japanese firm on the specific Japan law stuff. But if we're hired, it's because the documentation's got to be in English. And then similarly, you would have outbound work where, again, you're being hired for our expertise in international transactions, helping, for example, a Japanese client to acquire a non-U.S. target. I'm sorry, a non-Japanese target, and that could be in any country. But really, you're being hired because you're an international attorney with expertise in English, and the documentation would be in English. So, I'd really say the knowing Japanese out there is very important, so that it greases the wheels. You can really have a smooth interaction with clients. If you see some Japanese documentation, you recognize exactly what it is. I can tell what it says,
Hmm.
but I wouldn't be relying on myself as the one to read it in detail as an attorney.
Did you find that the Japanese clients would prefer to speak to you in Japanese, or they tried to speak to you rather in English, or just depends?
I think you're right in that it depends.
Right.
There are some clients who are quite fluent in English,
Yeah.
and that there's sort of a divide in how certain companies have English as a requirement for them to speak internally, for example, or the people that you're dealing with at those companies are very international themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say a lot of new economy type companies, internet companies may have people who are a little bit more international. Maybe they have a graduate degree from the United States.
Yeah.
Investment banks would usually have people who are very fluent in English. More old line Japanese companies, the industrial companies, might have chairs of the legal department or business development folks leading a transaction who are not quite as fluent.
Yeah.
But they do understand emails. I would say all of them, and they do appreciate when you send them an email. They go through it in great detail and spend a lot of time and really understand it very well. But the day-to-day conversations, maybe they're more comfortable in Japanese. And
Yeah,
so,
totally.
even if you're being hired sort of for your English language expertise, your expertise in doing English language documentation, having Japanese language skills ends up becoming pretty important.
Yeah. Could we have had this conversation in Japanese? Is your Japanese good enough to have had this conversation in Japanese?
I'm a little bit out of practice. I've been back in Silicon Valley for about 11 years.
I see.
But I'd say, something close to it. I
Yeah.
might not sound quite as facile as I do in the English language, of course, but I could get through it and
Yeah.
communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even though you're half Japanese, but obviously you grew up in this country, what did you think about the Japanese culture? Because it is very different, the way they do things and how they communicate, interact. I mean, did you find yourself really liking that, or did you find that kind of a hard adjustment?
Um, I'd say, it's kind of funny. Japanese Americans in the United States, our ancestors immigrated back in the Meiji era, in the 1800s.
Hmm.
So there's some traditional Japanese stuff that I think of as, culturally my inheritance, where we're a little bit old fashioned.
Hmm.
And so, when I went to Japan, I thought, oh, actually this is pretty modern compared to my understanding of Japanese culture. We'd have some slang words that I learned from, my parents or grandparents that, if you use them in Japan, people think it's really funny and old fashioned.
Nice.
So I found the interactions, people were very flexible, and people were very, you know, willing to accommodate people's different cultures and, interactions. So I never really noticed that. I never really had any, completely odd experiences, because I think mutually people are pretty conscious of cultural differences and are
Yeah.
very accommodating.
Yeah.
But I remember, going with a Japanese colleague of mine, like a Japanese qualified attorney, which we call a bengoshi, and we went to a visit, and he said, you're supposed to take your coat off and hold your coat like this when you come into the meeting. Don't come into the meeting with your coat on. And I had never even thought of that. And I had never done it. And I'm sure no one cared, because they're like, look, he's an American.
Yeah.
But when I was in a very Japanese context, maybe other Japanese people think I'm full of it here, but this is what my colleague told me, and I was very surprised.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, interesting. So when you went to MoFo, how long were you expecting to live in Japan? Were you thinking it was just going to be a few years, or were you planning, you're thinking it might be a long time, or what was your thinking?
So I was planning on it being a permanent move.
Oh, interesting.
It's interesting. A lot of people who I talked to who had worked in Japan previously told me, don't do it. Like, don't start out there.
Uh-huh.
Just don't do it. It'll be bad for your career, because you won't get trained up in, U.S. corporate work, M&A, which is what I was focused on.
Yeah.
But if you're one of those people who, even if everyone tells you not to do it, you still want to do it anyway, then you're the right fit for going and working out in Japan as a junior associate. So yeah, for me, I planned on it being a permanent move. It ended up being sort of a 2-year stint in my first stint out in Japan. But I met my wife out there. I really thought it was going to be a permanent stay.
Oh, so what drew you back then? Why did you move back?
So I'd say the first time moving back, there was some family health issues, and so I wanted to be back home. And there's kind of that draw. Home is always a draw, and you don't really realize it until you leave.
Yeah.
And then there's some good training opportunities actually back in the States. I ended up moving to Skadden as a third year, doing a slightly different M&A practice. It was something I really wanted to pursue. And then I had a mentor who I had worked with at MoFo who moved to Skadden, Tokyo, and he really recruited me hard to come back. He said, look,
Interesting.
I have an opening. We're a smaller office. I have an opening for a mid-level. And this opening isn't going to come around again for years and years. We're going to plug the hole with somebody. And I want it to be you. And so you could wait another 5 years and maybe hopefully join me, or you could come now. And it was a little earlier than I had planned. I think I went back out as like a 4th year or 5th year.
Oh, wow.
And I had intended on staying a little bit longer. I was at Skadden, LA at the time. But moving within Skadden was a pretty easy move.
Uh-huh.
And it was a mentor with whom I know I could grow a lot as an attorney, and so I wasn't too worried about my development as long as I was going to work with him.
Yeah.
And I did have a desire to move back at some point, and it was earlier than I thought it would be, but the desire was there.
Interesting. So the second time you went back to Japan, I didn't realize you went back again. You
Yeah.
actually was not thinking that was not going to be a permanent move. That was not the thinking.
The second time I moved out.
Yeah.
So, I would say the thought again was that it would be a permanent move. I'm not very good at forecasting this, obviously. But yeah, the second time I thought it was going to be a permanent move. We had just had our first child. He was about 4 or 5 months old when we moved back. And I ended up pretty happy when we moved back.
What brought you back the second time?
The job I had was fun at Skadden, LA. I loved my colleagues, really great practice. But I'd say I was doing, 50% M&A. And I wanted to do 100% M&A. The other 50% was doing like high yield bonds. And I just wanted to focus more on M&A. I did miss working in the international context. You do sort of complex and weird stuff, not just purely domestic stuff when you're working abroad. So professionally, those two things are quite interesting. And I think, all the reasons that I was interested in moving back to Japan in the first place, or why I was interested in moving to Japan in the first place, were still there. Tokyo being an amazing city to live in, the sort of culture roots thing being attractive to me.
Yeah, interesting. So do you miss Japan now? You've been back in the States for a while. You miss Japan, or do you go there a lot?
I tend to go back every once so often. My kids, so I think my second stint out there, let's see, I must have spent about 6 years there the second time around. So, the kids their experiences when they were young, they do remember living in Japan. Still have a lot of good friends out there. So yeah, I try to get back fairly often.
Yeah. Do you ever see yourself moving back to Japan? Is that a possibility? Do you see it at some point?
Yeah, sure. I have thought about it, and I've had conversations with folks about it from time to time. We all get recruiter calls all the time, right?
Yeah.
What happens though is you start running into certain life stages that make it hard to move.
Yeah.
And so I'd say a lot of people my age who are like 20 years out. I have kids in high school. I have a senior right now who's graduating. I have a sophomore, and the question starts becoming, do you really want to pick up and pull kids out of high school or middle school in order to make that move? Yeah. I'd say when people make that move, it tends to coincide with a child having a clean break between middle school and high school.
Yeah, for sure.
But once you're entering or elementary school and middle school, and those are sort of the stages at which slightly older folks who have children who are more like mid career are going to be able to move or are going to be tied up.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Jason, I really appreciate you taking the time to tell me about this. I visited Japan my first time last year, and it's just a super fascinating country. And so I was really excited to talk to somebody who's actually lived there and worked there professionally.
Really happy to talk about it. It's a real strange breed of folks, and it takes very particular interests and background for people to really want to work out there and develop a legal career out there. So, any way I can be a resource, really happy to talk about it. Really happy to speak today.
Really appreciate it. This is Richard Hsu and Jason Rabbitt-Tomita. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.